Guys, welcome back to chapter 9 of Toliver's Secret. I am going to warn you. I'm not warning you to not listen. I'm warning you just to let you know this chapter is a smidge longer than all the other ones. So if you're taking notes with me, make sure you got your notebook and pencil ready, and let's rock and roll with chapter 9. Running was easy enough at first. Swinging her blue bundle at her side, Ellen followed a company of soldiers stepping along in double time to the fast beating of drums. And after the men had come to the end of the town and turned into the fields to their campgrounds, she trotted behind the wagon trains. She could see that the wagons were piled high with things for the soldiers' camp, chests and canvas tents, and great iron pots for cooking. On either side of the road, soldiers were set up tents and building shacks. There was a bright red glow of campfires back in the fields as far as she could see. A pale blue haze of smoke drifted over the fields. It frightens me to see so many men getting ready to fight our army. The thought of the message in her loaf of bread made her run all the more quickly. It kept her from thinking about how hungry she was now and how the cold wind at her back cut through her wool jacket, which means the wool jacket wasn't really keeping her warm. But after she had passed the noisy hubbub in the fields around the camp, Ellen slowed down, for the road was rough, and there were no drums beating a quick march to help her hurry. If I can't run all the way to Elizabeth, she panted, at least I can keep up a fast walk. I'll get there before dark. Except for a group of horsemen who dashed past her, there was no one else on the road that wound through the snowy countryside. There was something queer about this road, she thought to herself. It looked like the roads back home, but it's different. As far as she could tell, there were the same snowy fields and fences made of the gnarled roots of trees, the same brown houses close to the road, the same orchards with a few dried apples clinging to the bare branches. But there were no people anywhere. There were no cows in the barns, no sheep in the sheepfolds, nor even chickens pecking in the farmyards. It was like walking in a strange, silent dream. There must be people inside, she thought, for in spite of the tightly closed windows, she could see thin wisps of smoke drifting up from the chimneys and blowing away in the wind. What a strange place. Not like Long Island. The people there had been friendly when she and Mother walked the 10 miles to New York in November. Sometimes they had been asked inside to warm themselves by the fire. New Jersey was different. There was nothing to do now but just keep marching along by herself. She remembered a song her father used to sing when he'd come home after drilling with the village militia. Blow the trumpets to arms. That was all she could remember at first. From the east to the west, blow the trumpets to arms. Father had told her Tom Paine wrote it. Yes, that is Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense, and called it the Liberty Tree. Let the far and the near all unite with cheer in defense of our Liberty Tree. Father's eyes really sparkled when he sang that song. She liked to remember him that way. Let the far and the near, she chanted a rhythm for her marching feet. Let the far and the near all unite with the cheer in defense of our Liberty Tree. Let the far and the near unite with our cheer. Her voice grew strong as she sang it out over and over, in defense of our Liberty Tree. Keeping time with her song, Ellen rounded a bend and stopped short of what she saw. The road disappeared into a woods. She had seen the woods ahead, but she hadn't thought the road would go right through the middle of it. Since the winter branches were bare, she could look deep into the forest of the brown tree trunks and evergreens. What evergreens are like when you think of a Christmas tree. Trees beyond trees as far as she could see. They seemed to go on for miles. The lonely road curved around a huge pine tree and disappeared. Everywhere there were sure to have been unknown dangers, prowling animals, bears, thieves. She could go no further. I can't do it. I can't go on. But you must do it, Ellen. I can't. I'm only 10. A courier is waiting for your message. I can't. I won't. There is naught else to be done. You must. And guys, she's just having a conversation with herself. Ellen stood and looked at the dark road curving ahead into the silent forest. Well, when there is something hard to be done, she said at last, just square your shoulders and start. Then she pulled her cap over her ears and raced down the road into the woods, looking from side to side as her feet flew over the frozen ground. Behind every tree there seemed to lurk a monster. Under every bush a wild and hungry animal waited to spring out at her. If only I can go to the end of the woods, she gasped. She could almost feel things clawing at her back. but she dared not look over her shoulder to see what they were. "Run faster, Ellen, run faster," she cried as she felt the wind push past her face. When at last she had to slow down, gasping for breath, she feared she would be flung to the ground and torn apart. But nothing happened. There was no monsters behind her. She could see not even one squirrel or small rabbit. The woods looked very quiet and serene, and that word serene means very calm. Patches of fresh white snow lay on the carpet of the brown leaves. Snow flecked the trunks of the great forest trees and collected in drifts like white pillows on the branches of the evergreens. Red berries that had not been eaten by the birds sparkled on the dogwood branches. If there were any animals here, they were asleep in the burrows or hollow logs. All around her, the woods were peaceful. Annabelle would like this, Ellen surprised herself with a thought. The dogwood berries made her think of her cousin. Last winter they had had fun decorating the church for Annabelle's wedding. When they went to the woods to gather greens and red berries, Annabelle had cried out happily, "Why, the forest is more beautiful in winter than it is in summer." The forest was beautiful, and Ellen was no longer afraid of it. As she trotted along, she realized she no longer was fearful of it at all. After a while, the quiet was broken by the sound of a dog barking and the thudding of horses' hooves on the hard dirt road. Ellen looked over her shoulder and saw a small dog jumping angrily at the heels of a skinny old horse. Paying no attention to the dog, the horse plodded along heavily. The steam from his nose looked like the steam from a kettle on a hearth, which means a kettle on a stove. The rider was a man so thin he seemed to have been made of sticks of kindling wrapped in a fluttering coat. His chin rested on a bunch of straw at his throat, and a long pointed nose seemed to hold it in place. From each arm hung big wooden baskets, limp and empty. Ellen slipped behind a pine tree, but the little dog had seen her and ran in circles around her feet, barking wildly. "Why are you hiding there, boy?" the man called out in a thin, high voice with a twang on the edges, which means he had kind of an accent. Ellen held her breath. "Are you a neighbor or a runaway?" asked the man suspiciously. "You got a gun?" "I'm not a runaway," said Ellen, "and I haven't any gun." "Then come out and show yourself." Ellen slowly stepped out from behind the tree. She could see now that it was not a bundle of straw at his throat, but it was a dirty, scraggly beard. More straw-colored hair hung down in the back in a bushy clump. "What's that in your hand?" The man seemed to talk through his long nose. "Only a loaf of bread." Ellen held up the blue bundle for the man to see. The dog barked and jumped for it so wildly she had to hold it high above her head to keep it away from him. "Where are you going?" "To Elizabethtown." "To Elizabeth? 13 miles?" He whistled through the space in his front teeth where they were missing. "You'll never make it, and besides, it will be dark as pitch before you get to Elizabeth." Ellen stared at him. Did you just say 13 miles? She cried. "I thought it was 10. I've walked 2 or 3 already." "It may be 10 miles as a crow flies, but it's 13 miles by the road from Amboy. You've walked about 2, I'd say. That leaves 11 more to go." Ellen was so disappointed to say another word. Perhaps the man was wrong. "Well," he grunted as he wiped his fingers across the end of his nose, "my house is only a half a mile from Elizabeth. Get up behind me. I need a helper to hold these baskets." As if he had understood what his master said, the dog turned his head to look at Ellen and snorted disapprovingly through his big, loose lips. Ellen jumped back. She had never ridden a horse before. "Step lively, boy," which means come on. The man spoke crossly. The horse rolled his eyes and shook his leathery skin and stretched over his ribs. He looked far from happy to having another rider, Ellen thought. And the man did not look friendly either, but she could not walk 11 more miles. Since there was nothing else she could do, she'd have to take this ride. The farmer slipped his foot from the stirrup and reached down a bony hand to help her. How do I climb up?" Ellen asked. "Never been on a horse before?" cried a man in surprise. "A big boy like you?" "No," said Ellen. She was going to say my father was a schoolmaster. He didn't have a horse, but she thought better of it. "Then put your foot here and I'll give you a hoist," which means he's going to help her up. Ellen put her foot in the stirrup and awkwardly climbed and squirmed her way up behind him, clutching the loaf of bread in her chest with one hand. She was glad she didn't have skirts and petticoats to get in the way as she straddled the horse's bony back. Very carefully, she tucked her blue bundle inside of her jacket and arranged the handles of the baskets on her arms. When she leaned forward and put her arms around the man's waist, she knew the bread was safe between her chest and his thin back. From the odd smell of his baskets, it was hard to guess what he had carried in them, but his bushy hair that tickled her face smelled of sweet wood smoke. It was a comforting smell, although sitting behind him like this was an uncomfortable way to travel. The bouncing made her teeth clatter and jar her spine. Still, it was better than walking 11 miles with a dog jumping at her, trying to get her bread. The man pointed a long finger at the little dog. "Go home to your master," he commanded sternly. "Now," he said, and when he saw the dog scurry off, "What's your name, boy?" "Toliver." She could say that name without even stumbling now. "Mine's Murdock." He handed back some oat cakes that he took from his pocket. "Most boys are hungry," he said. Hungry? She was starved. She had given her corn cakes to Dow on the boat. When he looked over his shoulder and saw that she had gobbled them up quickly, he handed her 2 more, but he didn't ask her any questions. They rode in silence to the end of the woods and out along the road, passing more closed-up farmhouses. She wanted to ask him about the people inside, but Mr. Murdock was not a talkative man. She could not guess whether he was for the British or for the Patriots. He said nothing when he had to stop his horse to let some soldiers ride by. Best not ask him which side he was on if she wanted to continue her ride. He'd be quite surprised if he knew he was helping the Patriots, especially if he was a Tory. Remember, a Tory is someone who was completely loyal to the king. These were mixed up times, all right. Oh, that sounds pretty convenient. We could probably relate to that a little bit. Ellen remembered Long Island and the long trip that she and her mother had made. No one ever asked the refugees who staggered along the roads which side they were on. All of them were people in trouble. Some of them had great rolls of bedding and cooking pots on their backs, and some just pulled carts piled high with household goods. On top of everything rode small children in baskets and old people. Farm people along the way were kind to them. She peered around Mr. Murdock's arm and asked, "Why are those houses all closed up so tightly?" The question seemed to make him angry. Ellen could feel his back growing stiff and straight as he cried out, "People have to stay behind locked doors these days since the British came. It's those redcoats. They take everything. Just walk in and take anything they want. Most farmers hide their cows in the woods and pigs and chickens too." At the sound of the horse's hooves splashing through the water, Ellen looked down fearfully. They were crossing a stream. It was shallow enough, but thin sheets of ice formed around the rocks at the edge. Suddenly, Mr. Murdock stood up in the stirrups and waved his thin arm as if he had a sword in his hand. "King George ain't gonna push us around. We'll fight back," he cried. Ellen had tried to keep hold of his waist as he stood up, but as she raised her arms, she could feel the blue bundle slip out from under her jacket. She lunged for it. "My bread!" she shrieked. "Stop the horse!" "Your what?" cried Mr. Murdock as he threw a startled look over his shoulder. He yanked back on the reins, which what they used to control the horse. The horse was startled too. He slipped and slid on icy rocks, sank down on his haunches, and darted up again. "My bread!" Ellen screamed. "My loaf of bread is gone!" Mr. Murdock reined the horse by the side of the stream. "Did you drop my baskets?" he yelled. Quickly, Ellen clutched the saddle with both hands, swung her leg over the horse's rump, and slid down his side. She didn't stop to wonder about the slippery rocks or how deep the water might be. She waded into the stream, which means she kind of walked into it, up to her knees until she could scoop up her bundle. "He might have told me he was going to stand up," she grumbled as she opened the kerchief and looked at the bread. It was soggy, but the good strong crust held its shape. Mr. Murdock didn't see the need to apologize. Instead, he dismounted, gathered up his baskets, and shook the water from them angrily. He glared at her. "Why did you drop my baskets?" "It was just lucky they weren't filled with leather hides I took to Amboy." Ellen hung her head, and she felt defiant, which is when someone goes against what someone else is saying. Why, it was his fault, she thought. He should have told her he was going to stand up. "You made me drop my bread when you stood up," she declared stubbornly. "I had to get it before it floated away and was lost." That was a witless thing to do, which means silly. Happens my wife could give you another loaf. This is a present for an old man's birthday. My mother baked it this morning, Ellen said hastily. But I'm sorry I dropped your baskets. Come on then, climb back up on the horse, he said. Here's a picture. Her going in and getting the bundle. There's Mr. Murdock. Doggy still following him. When they were well on their way, Mr. Murdock turned and looked back at her suspiciously. You're a queer one, he said, which means weird. You got something inside that bread, Ellen gasped. She buried her face in his back and blurted out this first word that came to her mind. I'd get a whipping with a birch rod if I was lost, which means a tree branch. Reckon you would, Mr. Murdock said. Makes me think of my father. He cut a hole in the bottom of a loaf of bread and put money inside it. That was a stupid thing. Anyone could see where the hole was. Ellen was glad that the snuff box had been put in the dough and baked inside. There was nothing that would show in case he wanted to look at it.